'Twas a long time ago, in a place long forgotten, in a world that is not visited all too often. For in this land there is a tale to be told, and with it a great lesson to unfold. Now come with me through this old beaten door, to where legends gather to settle a war. For two kingdoms in this world stand tall and proud, both very different, thus a conflict was found. One known as Demacia, ruled with justice and fear, and old Noxus, whose motives were quite unclear. But during these two feuds a great disaster took place, when a jungler took over the mid lane by mistake. It was late one night in the land of Noxus, and in the sky the moon was shining full and bright. A scarecrow sat alone that clear autumn night. He looked old, quite rigid, and a bit frail. Fiddlesticks was his name, whom this story entails. He was tall and thin, with a frame made of sticks, with a face like a bag sewn with many fabrics. His eyes glowed green as the lanterns surrounded by moths, and he wore an old torn robe made of sackcloth. Fiddle was growing old of the same old sights. Tired of it all, he proclaimed to the night, "I'm sick of the ganks, the creeps, and the jungle. I'm tired of being the best of the bundle. I'm bored of only using my drain and my smite, and I'm weary of causing the laners such a terrible fright. I don't like my life farming here in the wood, while a void grows in my heart I can't fill if I could." While the scarecrow declared all that he crave, a little figure peeked her head from behind a grave. She was thin and soft, with bright glowing eyes, wearing a self-stitched dress, too small for her size. With a purple skirt that ended with a twist and a twirl, Oriana was her name, the Clockwork Girl. She watched Fiddlesticks with great disbelief. It saddened her to see him in such grief. She laid her head against a cold stone tomb as she watched Fiddle, the harbinger of doom. You see now he was the only friend Ori had, and he never noticed her, which made her quite sad. Some time ago at Noxus, a season or two, Oriana came to the old town to find something new. She was very different from those in this land, yet felt at home in the city owned by monster and man. Ori felt wronged by the sights and was to leave without a sound when she met dear Fiddlesticks, who gladly showed her around. Fid led her to the castle that housed all its leaders. He took her to museums and the great Noxus Theater, the crypts and the homes where the unliving stayed, and last the old dark park, where the residents played. Because she was seen with Fiddlesticks all through the zone, the people of Noxus accepted her as one of their own. Ori would forever hold that scarecrow in high esteem, for he showed her what it was like to live in a dream. Though she still knew she was different from all the rest, that she was just a robot girl, not of the best. She didn't belong with being a friend of this doom, and if they grew very close, others would find out too soon. Keeping her distance from the old dread king, she watched as he sang in the night with a harmonic scream, "I'm tired of my life's work and all that it takes, of being held back by my talents and by the stakes. I can't find what my heart desires with all of my might," he moaned as he walked off into the night. After he left, Ori tried to stand to her feet, but she could not, for she felt too weak. Instead, she only pushed herself up to a kneel, and for the first time in her life, she began to feel. After seeing her love's pain being yelled to the sky, she rested her head back on the cold tomb, and for the first time, a robot began to cry. Fiddlesticks walked and wandered lost in deep thought, thinking of his life and all that he fought. All night until morning he was lost in his mind until he realized he'd left the twisted tree line. He looked around completely lost and felt a deep chill. So to find his way home he climbed up a hill. When he got to the top he looked with great awe, for in the distance he saw a giant wall. Within the great gates was something like a field, with many great stone statues each holding a shield. There were 3 great paths over a river's drift, with a magical sign in the front reading Summoner's Rift. After taking a second to gather his senses, Fid raced off to this new place in the distance. Making sure not to be seen, the Scarecrow hurried and entered the rift behind a snow flurry. The Scarecrow hid himself inside a small brush, from which he could see something that gave him a rush. In front of him, no more than a block or so, he saw a figure walking through the snow. Fiddlesticks gazed at the thing off in the distance, and held himself back with all his resistance. A large being, half crab and half man, upon 4 metal legs he did stand, with a cannon in hand and the other a saw. Forward the creature began to crawl. Fiddlesticks recognized the man he had sought, for it was none other than the mighty Urgot. Staying silent, Fid sat far out of sight, as Lord Urgot fought a very strange fight. He couldn't move, as if he was in a stun, and watched in amazement at what was being done. After the battle, Fiddlesticks ran back to the Noxus Plain to tell his friends of the tale he saw in Middle Lane. Back at home, everyone gathered around to hear about the place that Fiddle had found. He told them of the rift and all that took place, and that battle that Lord Urgot had to face. He told them of minions, items, and stages, the difference between fighters and mages. They all stood in amazement of the tale prepared, except for Oriana, who looked rather scared. After they left, Ori tried to talk to Fiddle. She felt better now that they were alone, just a little. Fiddlesticks, I've never seen you so bright. Could this place really have brought you so much delight? Surely Noxus has everything that you need, and perhaps what you want you can easily see. Fid stopped and thought for a short while, until his face lit up with a smile. He grabbed Ori's hand, which gave her a startle. Could this be the moment she would always marvel? My friend, you are rather correct. My life has been in complete misdirect. I am the king of all doom, I cannot be stopped. So I should go to the rift and take Urgot's spot. Oriana stood in complete and utter fear. This was the opposite of what she wanted to hear. In her chest, her heart began to ache, so she tried to speak to correct this mistake. But she stopped when she saw Fid had such a thrill, and he left off her hand as she stood very still, and thanked Oriana for opening the door. She had shown him the task he had been longing for. Oriana stood as Fiddle rushed back to his fields. She fell to her knees under all the weight she must wield. Not only did she not tell Fid how she felt, enough, which made her heart want to melt, but he was heading to be killed off in a war, so she just sat there the entire night on the floor. The very next morning, Fid called back on his peers and told them of his plan and asked for volunteers. He would prepare himself to take the mid lane, but first they must get Urgot out of the frame. Just as he asked for someone to take up this task, 3 figures stepped forward, all wearing a mask. 2 were short, the other quite tall, the oddest bundle anyone had ever saw. It would be our honor to serve you fine, said Caitlin, Timo, and Tristana at the same time. Now these 3 were known for being quite odd, known in Demacia as some of the biggest frauds. They seemed to fit in rather well under their masks, so Fiddlesticks allowed them to take up the task. With a laugh and a giggle, the 3 left the scene and headed to their hideout deep in the green. There they devised quite an evil plan on how they would catch the big metal crab man. Now the rest of Noxus all worked hard together to prepare Fid for his great endeavor. Morgana the Fallen prepared him his potions, and the great Swain showed him magical motions. Vladimir showed the Scarecrow how to be a good farmer, and Oriana took the task of making his armor. Although she did not agree with Fid's coming fight, she still didn't have the heart to deny him his right. Now back at the rift, Urgot was fighting some creeps, when suddenly he heard a loud terrible shriek. He looked at a bush from which came a small groan. Urgot had thought he was all alone. He walked into the bush and was stopped by a loud snap. He stood in shock. He knew it was a trap. Urgot tried desperately to get out of its track until 3 little figures shoved him into a sack. Urgot was brought back feeling very ashamed, where he was presented to Fiddlesticks, who proclaimed, "Urgot, your time in the rift has come to a close. You are no longer needed for your damage or slows. It is I who will now take over mid-lane. Please do not worry, Urgot, for I am well trained." Fiddlesticks left as the crowd gave off a cheer. Oriana watched him leave as she shed a single tear. He had left and she could no longer stop him. Knowing what would happen made her quite grim. She could not just let him walk off to his death, so she had to think of a plan to save his last breath. Now Urgot was thrown into a strange room with heavy stone walls much like a tomb. He struggled to get out of his shackles, when in the darkness he heard a loud cackle. From the shadows stepped forward some men, wielding different large weapons to slash and to rend. Urgot recognized them as no feeders, but Garen, Jarvan, and Lux, the Demacia leaders. Garen stepped forward at Teemo, Kate, and Trist, and said to them while holding a fist, "Very well done, my 3 little friends. You did exactly what we did intend. Now go back to Noxus, we no longer have use, and hurry, as we set up a noose." The 3 scoundrels looked at one another quite confused, and Kate stepped forward feeling rather abused. "But Garen," she said with anger in her eyes, "this wasn't the plan that you had comprised. You told us that if we helped, we could go back to Demacia, where we hang our hats." With a laugh, Garen answered, "Ha! How absurd! Do you really think that we would hold to our word? With Urgot gone and out of the way, Noxus will fall this very day. Now leave us, you traitors! We have no time to deal with you, or prepare to die." Knowing they were outmatched, the 3 ran all the way back to Noxus's land. Then they saw that they were too late, for the Demacian army was nearing the gate. With a laugh and a joke, Garen pulled Urgot near. "Listen now closely, I want you to hear. With you and Fiddle, Noxus is best. Out of the way, we can deal with the rest. Don't worry, dear Urgot, Fid will soon be adrift, for we have a surprise waiting for him at the rift." Deep in Noxus there was a panic. Many people ran past Ori, being quite frantic. As they prepared for a war, a summoner appeared and told Oriana just what she feared. "For years we have tried to hold back this war, but our magics have become too weak and too sore. We made a deal with each city's master that the winner at the rift would decide this disaster." The mage turned and looked towards the ground, and told her the rest of what he had found. Each side is confident that their team will win, but I fear for Noxus it looks quite grim. If Demacia wins at the rift's fight nearing, they may attack Noxus without our interfering. But if Noxus somehow goes on the winning path, Demacia will pull back or face the summoner's wrath. And just as he came, he then disappeared. Ori knew that the end could be near. She pulled out a cloth, and with a long piece of thread, quickly she sewed a note for aid that pled. She called up to a crow from the old graveyard, and told it that the letter was for Fiddle, whom it regard. The bird flew off with a call and a yelp, Oriana ran to find Urgot to ask him for help. Back at Summoner's Rift, Fid prepared for the fight. Trying to remember his spells he learned to recite. As he prepared himself at the empty mid-lane, he saw a distant crow fly above the game. It flew down looking badly beaten and weak, with a note it had lodged in its beak. Fiddlesticks took the note and tucked it away, not wanting to be distracted from this, his big day. Just then, as the moon began to dawn, a ghostly whisper was heard, "Minions have spawned!" With a stretch and a laugh, Fid danced to his spot, and he did exactly what he had been taught. But Fid was still very misinformed, and he had no idea what he was in for. As the minions all met in their roads mid, Ash the archer arrived and saw Fid. Although she expected the one known as Urgot, her job for her team she had never forgot. 'Twas the nightmare in mid lane, and all in my sight, all the creatures were in battle, all in a fight. With a scarecrow dancing as he focused on a last hit, would soon feel true pain from a terrible crit. When Fid least expected, Ash drew back her bow. She aimed at his heart, but struck him a bit low. With a gasp of pure shock, Fid grabbed at his chest. He fell to his knees, needing to rest. Ash saw her chance to take over the lane. She darted forward and prepared for his drain. But he did not even shoot out a spell. He was not prepared to be attacked. All was going to hell. Instead, he tried to run back away, but Ash continued to shoot arrows that made him stay. Fiddle rushed past his tower, gasping for air. He arrived to a grave that would be safe and fair. Fiddlesticks looked to the sky, feeling quite harrowed, until he was hit by a well-guided arrow. Fid fell to his back, knowing he'd failed. But what would this loss truly entail? Over the treetops he could see the towers explode, up to the Nexus, which then did implode. He knew his life was over, so he reached at his side and pulled out that old letter he intended to hide. The note was from Oriana, the best friend he had, and within it had a message that made Fid more sad. It was a cry for help. The fate of his home was on the line. If he lost at the rift, Noxus would fall, and at the end was a sign. From that young clockwork girl he never listened, so he looked up at the stars as they began to glisten. Thinking of all that he had let down, he just watched the sky, and there on that tombstone he began to cry. He held that old note up to his broken crest and gave his last with his dying breath. As the scarecrow's body lay on the old grave, two floating beings watched from a nearby cave. The first, an old man with mad hair and long flowing beard, holding a broken clock that was reverse geared. And the other was as beautiful as the man was old. She wore a blue dress and held a harp made of gold. Around them magic sparkled in a magnificent aura, and their names were no other than Zillion and Sona. Sona's voice chimed, though her lips didn't move. How could we let this happen? Now Noxus is doomed. We were supposed to make sure peace stayed in this land, and now time grows short, like an hourglass with little sand. We must stop what is about to take place. Zillion replied, not impressed by her grace. My dear girl, we are not to decide what time has in store for those who reside. The Noxus hero has fallen, he is no more. Now we must prepare for the consequences that are in store. But just then Sona gave Zillion a pitiful look, and with all of his power he had, it took, shaking his head saying this is the last time that he would interfere, for it felt like a crime. He took his clock and he spun it around until from the corpse of Fiddlesticks a breath did sound. He sat up and looked at the cave to see whom he had to thank for being saved. But no one was there, it was just empty and black, and on that old tomb Fiddlesticks just sat. Realizing he had a second chance to set things right, he pushed himself to his feet and ran back to Noxus with all his might. Fid charged over the hill where he first discovered the rift, not even looking back for his mind was adrift. He ran through the tree line following the old winding path, trying to forget all he had done and regretting the past. Pushing onward for hours, hoping he would be back in time, worried of what happened to his home and what he would find. Back with Urgot, the Demacians toyed, taunting and laughing of how Noxus was being destroyed. Just as Lux was going to say another jeer, she was interrupted by a close-thrown sharp gear. With a thud, the weapon pinned against the wall. The Demacians grabbed their weapons and stood together tall. Not a beast or a man came from the shadows of the room, but Oriana hobbled into the tomb. She looked around nervously, shaking a bit, but held her ground and did not submit. Caitlin and the Yordles told me of this spot. Now lay down your weapons, I've come to free Urgot. Another laugh burst from the three Demacian men, and they asked her what it was that she did intend. Fid was dead, there's nothing left to say, and Noxus would be theirs within the next day. Oriana tried to ignore them and look somewhat strong, but she knew. Tears filled her eyes and she tried to fight back, but all the Demacians did was let out a laugh. Now they yelled and taunted how her efforts were in vain, and about how her friend had just been slain, with crude remarks about how she inferred that the great one known as Fiddle could have ever loved her. Now Oriana slumped to her knees, as the others continued to mock and to tease. With her hands held to her eyes, a miracle she did pray. Lost in her trance, Garvin held up his blade. He said she had delayed for far too long, and swung his sword at her neck as she whispered her favorite song. With her eyes closed, she sat completely still. She wondered if this was what it was like to have been killed. She opened her eyes to see a sight to be restored. The one known as Fiddlesticks held back Garen's sword. Garen, Jarvan, and Lux all backed up to the wall, as Fiddlesticks, Oriana, and Urgot all stood tall. "You're supposed to be dead!" yelled Lux, filled with rage. "I know," smirked Fid, and he ran with his scythe to engage. The six all met in a fight unlike they ever expected. The loud sound of sword on blade was heard as they connected. Working together, the heroes all fought, for the future of their lands was all that they sought. After a couple of minutes, the Demacians were thrown to the ground, and they looked up at Fid, Urgot, and Oriana, not making a sound. Garen mocked them again once more. "You don't have the heart to end this war." Fiddlesticks filled with rage, remembering how Oriana was brought to tears. He looked at them dead in the eyes and said, "No, I'll show you the true meaning of fear!" Just as his words ended, he cast a spell that gave the Demacians such terror, as if they were in hell. After it was done, the three walked out of that room, while the three Demacians were lost in their doom. They looked over at Noxus that had taken a beating, but off in the horizon, the Demacian army was retreating. They went back to their homes and were welcomed by their peers. They had saved Noxus, as the town gave out a loud cheer. While everyone was celebrating, Fid felt like something was gone. So he looked at the old gates to see Oriana walked off toward the dawn. The Clockwork Girl walked to the top of that old hill, where Fiddlesticks once stood, looking for a new thrill. She sat down and looked out at the rising sun, thinking to herself how Noxus had finally won. As she sat dreaming of what would happen next in her life, a familiar voice said behind her, "My dear Oriana, would you be my wife?" She stood up slowly and turned around as Fiddlesticks made his way up that old mound. "My dearest friend, we've been apart for far too long. Now please won't you join me in singing this song?" Fid looked into Oriana's glowing eyes, and together their song did rise. They met on the top of that old hill they had missed, and together that Scarecrow and Robot shared true love's first kiss. To be together forever, they could be their own team, and Fiddlesticks and Oriana no longer had to dream.